Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to give you a very high level summary of the Canadian immigration system and its components and its structure. And then in the future videos, I'm going to talk about in more detail about the various streams and each pathway within that system. Before we get started, my name is Madhur Parashar. I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant and RCIC based in Vancouver. My contact information is here. If you're looking for paid consultations and immigration application assistance, feel free to reach out at this email and this phone number. Okay, let's get started. So if you want to come to Canada, there are two broad categories in which you would fall. You either want to come here temporarily as a temporary resident or permanently as a permanent resident or PR, right? So let's talk about the temporary pathway first. So when you come here as a temporary resident, it means that you are coming here for a limited amount of time. You prove to the government that you will come here temporarily for whatever reason you're coming here, and then you will leave by a certain date, and that you have ties to your home country which will take you back. So you have to convince the visa officer about these things, and then they will allow you to come here as a temporary resident. So a temporary residence falls under three broad categories. So the first one is as a visitor. So this is just a regular tourist, comes to Canada, meets friends, family, tourist, goes to tourist spots, and then goes back home, right? The second category is as a student. So you apply to a Canadian college, you get an acceptance letter, you apply for a student visa, and you come to Canada as an international student. The third category is as a worker. So you apply for a work permit, you come here and work for an employer. When your work permit expires, you go back to your home country. So theoretically, these are the three broad categories under which temporary residents will fall. So I'll just show you this in a little diagram here. So as you can see, those are the three categories. Now, the reason I made arrows between them is because you can jump from one temporary category to another, meaning you might come here as a visitor and then decide that you want to enroll in a college and study here. So you apply for a study permit and you become a student. After graduation, you get a work permit. So you start working and you become a worker. After your work permit expires, maybe you want to study again and you become a student again. Or if your work permit and study permit have expired, you can apply to become a visitor again. So it's possible to jump between these categories once you're here. So that's temporary residence. Now let's talk about permanent residence. So there are three major pathways to becoming a permanent resident. So the first one is the most popular, that is the economic immigration pathway. Canadian government is looking for people who have the right skills and the right language, who are young, who are healthy, and so on, who can contribute to the country's economic growth. So you can apply under various economic pathways and prove to the government that, hey, I have the language skills, I have the professional skills, I am young, I'm healthy, I am everything you're looking for. Please give me a permanent resident card, and you get approved, and that's how you become a PR through an economic immigration pathway. The second pathway is family sponsorship. So if you have somebody in Canada, meaning who is a permanent resident or a Canadian citizen, they can say that I want this family member who is a foreigner to come to Canada permanently, and I want to sponsor them. So a Canadian citizen or PR can sponsor a wife or a husband, that's their spouse or common law partner. They can sponsor their dependent children, their parents, their grandparents, in very limited cases, their brothers and sisters. So that's the family immigration pathway. And then there is the protected persons pathway, which is for refugees, asylum seekers, people who are facing danger in their home country can apply to the government and say, look, I cannot, if I stay in my country, I have a lot of danger, I'm facing a lot of danger, so please allow me to immigrate to Canada. And if you have a genuine case, the Canadian government may grant you permanent residence. So those are the three broad pathways. Let's look at another diagram for that. So those are the permanent resident pathways. Okay, so just like you jump between temporary resident pathways, now in permanent resident, you don't jump between the pathways. Once you're a PR, you're a PR. But what I'm trying to say is you can pursue multiple PR pathways at the same time. So for example, you might apply for to immigrate as a worker, but at the same time, if you have a spouse or a parent or somebody in Canada, they can also sponsor you, and the two pathways will run in parallel, and whichever gets approved first, you become a PR. Right? Now it's possible to jump from temporary residence to permanent residence. So a lot of people, in fact, most people these days, that's what they're doing. They're coming here as temporary residents in one of the temporary resident categories that I showed you. So they come here as a student or a visitor or a worker, and they try to become a permanent resident through an economic or family or refugee pathway. So you can transition from one bucket to another. And that's how people can become permanent residents, either directly from abroad, which is very difficult these days, by the way, or after you come here. You can jump from this pool to the other pool. So that is pretty much a high-level overview of Canadian immigration. Now, this is super high level. This is probably 1% of what Canadian immigration is all about. Now, there are several categories, subcategories, programs within each of these buckets. So, for example, I'll just give you a very brief overview, a very brief example of how complicated this can become. Let's look at this diagram again. Now, under temporary residents, if you look at the worker category, you might come here on an open work permit, which is basically independent of any employer. You basically no employer is sponsoring you to come to Canada. You're coming to Canada on an open work permit, meaning you can work for anyone. And or you might come on a closed work permit, in which case you are sponsored by an employer. You depend on the employer, and you can only work for that employer. To work only for an employer or to get a closed work permit, you might need an LMIA, or your work permit might be LMIA exempt. So as you can see, there are so many categories within worker. Now let's switch to the permanent resident side of things. Under economic pathway, there are dozens of pathways. There are three pathways that fall under something called express entry, which is very popular, and we'll get to it in our future videos. There's something called PNP, that's the provincial nominee program. So a province in Canada might select you as an immigrant. So there are 10 different provinces and territories. Each has their own program. So there are so many subcategories there. There might be care. You might come here as a child caregiver or an entrepreneur, and there are so many categories there. Under family sponsorship, you might get sponsored by a spouse, by a grandparent, by a child, and so many categories there. So as you can see, it gets very complicated very fast. Okay, so and when somebody says, I want to come to Canada, okay, where do we start? We either start, can you come here as temporary resident? If you do, how can you transition to a permanent residence? Under which category under which pathway would you fall? Under which subcategory will you be eligible? How can we make that determination? And how can we eventually make that application? So it gets complex very fast. We will continue to explore every single category in our future videos. So stay tuned, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And of course, if you want to hire us, become a book a paid consultation call, feel free to reach out at this email or this phone number, and we'll be happy to assist you through your Canadian immigration journey. In the future videos, we'll talk about each of these streams in much more detail. Thank you.